Hey everybody, welcome to this video presentation on how to do a DCPromo. And in this video presentation, we're just going to make sure that we give you not only just an idea of how to do the DCPromo, but to make sure you understand how it really fits into your environment. So in this graphic I have on the screen, you can see that we have a router. So we have an IP address that faces to the internal network, which we can see here. And that IP address is 10.10.10. X or 10.10.10/24 with the .1 address. Our server that is going to become our domain controller is on the 10.10.10 network, and we have a Windows 7 workstation also sitting on the 10.10.10 network. And really the idea here is to, instead of just showing you just a DCPromo, we want to show you how it fits into your environment as a whole, because you're just not going to, grab a server and just install 2008 R2 and do a DCPromo. You're going to install a server with a network card that's plugged into a network with DNS involved in routing and then do a DCPromo, right? So we want to make sure that we have that entire picture in place for you before we start. So in this environment, we have the router, has a public card, has a private card. We got our server that's going to be our domain controller. Now it's a 2008 R2 SP1 server. It's already been renamed to DC1. And one thing I want to point out is like a little checklist of things before you do your DCPromo. One thing that's very important is to make sure that whatever the name that you want to use for your domain controller is the name you have before you actually do the DCPromo. Now, you can, with certain domain functional levels, actually have the ability to rename the domain controller. But even though, depending on the domain functional level, you have the ability to actually rename the domain controller, it's a good idea to avoid that at all costs and try to avoid having to rename your domain controller. We can also do the same thing with our domain. We can perform a DCPromo, and we're going to give our domain a name. And in this example, we're going to use itvc.local. And for sure, we could change our mind and want a different name later. But changing the domain name is also a big hassle. So when you're going through your checklist of planning, you want to make sure that whatever names you're going to use are the names you're going to stick with. And you don't want to be changing the names of something that's going to support everything in your infrastructure. Because if you think about it, this very first domain controller, this very first domain is your building block for your entire Microsoft Active Directory infrastructure that you're going to build within your company. The proper names are very important to make sure we have those in place. So definitely something you want to have on your checklist. The other thing here that's very important is the IP address that we have on our domain controller. It's also important that we have just one NIC in our domain controller. We can run into some weird problems with dual NICs or multiple IP addresses on our domain controller, because everything that we do in Active Directory is dependent upon DNS being set up correctly. And what can happen sometimes, if you have a domain controller that's acting as a router with two network cards or whatever the case may be, extra IP addresses, when everything is all said and done, we're going to end up with IP addresses and names in our DNS configuration. And we want to really just see this domain controller just as one name with one IP address. We don't want it showing up in DNS with multiple IPs. So one way to solve that problem is to have one NIC and to have one IP address on that domain controller. So be careful what box you install it on. If it's got two network cards or some kind of weird network configuration, try to avoid that at all costs. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at our actual server. So this server right here is DC1. Now it's not a domain controller yet, but we can go to the properties of the computer name. We can actually see that we have named it DC1. It's still in a work group. Once we create a domain, that'll change into a domain name. So we made sure we named the computer. Also, we have an IP address on this box. Let's look at our IP configuration. So we can see here our IP address on our card. And under IP4, we're going to verify our IP address. So the IP address of this machine is 10.10.10.100 with a 255 mask, and our gateway is 10.10.10.1. Now our current DNS is pointing to 10.10.10.1, which is the same as our gateway. So what we're doing right now is pointing to a DNS server that I installed on this 2008 R2 box, which is also an RAS server performing a simple NAT to allow outbound access. And this DNS that we're pointing to is also configured to point to the outside world. So this guy right here is also forwarding his information out to a well-known public internet. So when we're done doing the DCPromo, what we're going to do is we're going to change the configuration of our DNS, because right now he's dependent on pointing to this external DNS server. After the DCPromo is completed, we'll see that he will be pointing to himself for DNS, because we're going to actually install DNS on this box that is the domain controller. Okay, so this is okay for now, but this is going to change, and we'll take a look at this when we're done with our DCPromo. Right, so a couple things, right? Make sure you got the right name of your domain controller. Make sure the name that you're going to use for your domain is something you're going to stick with. Verify that you have one NIC with one IP address, and figure out where he's pointing to for his gateway and for his DNS current information. So with that in place, you're ready to go ahead and do your DCPromo. Of course, you might want to make sure, of course, that your whatever server it is you have configured with the proper Windows updates. Make sure it's fully updated. Also, there are some disk drive considerations. Now, this particular server, let's go ahead and take a look at the management of this server. This particular server just has one hard drive. So if I go to my storage configuration, we can see that there's just one disk in this server that we're installing onto. Maybe if you have a higher end server, maybe this one disk is a RAID 5. Maybe you might want to have a mirrored pair for your log files and a separate disk for your actual Active Directory database. And we'll talk about that before we go through the install. I would think in most installations, if you're installing this on a physical box, that you're going to have most likely either some kind of a stripe or a RAID 5, and you just put everything on that one C drive. So the operating system is going to see just the one drive, the C drive, but underneath that, you're going to have some kind of a RAID configuration of some type, whether it's mirrored or whether it's a RAID 5, something with some kind of fault tolerance built into it. Now, in this demonstration, what I'm actually doing right now is this demo right here is in a VM, right? So I'm using VMware Workstation to perform this demonstration, and I'm doing this in VMware Workstation 8, which is kind of interesting because you can actually take a VM that you build in VMware Workstation 8, and then you can upload that and port that into your data store in your vSphere environment, and the VMs that we build do not have to be converted with vCenter Converter. So you can actually take this virtual machine and just port it right into your vSphere environment. We can also build this using a VHD, using virtual PC to use with Hyper-V as well. So whether it's a Hyper-V environment or a VMware environment, those are portable into those environments. The other thing I want to point out before we start is something that's new in 2008 and above, is that in 2008, we have to actually install what is called the ADDS role. So a new feature in 2008 and above is something called roles and features. And it used to be in 2003 that you could just do a DCPromo and it would just take off and do its thing. In 2008 and above, what we need to do is add the ADDS role. So we can just check that off right there, and this will lay down what we need, which is the .NET framework, whatever the latest version is, and that'll actually install the ADDS role. Okay, and it'll go through the wizard and do the install. But I'm not going to do that right now, because what I want to show you is when you go to do the DCPromo, if you don't have the ADDS role already laid down, the DCPromo process will do that for you, right? So we're ready to go ahead and perform the DCPromo. So one more time, just before we start, make sure you got the right name, the name of the server itself. Make sure you've picked a name for your domain. Also, this very first domain is going to be what's called your forest root domain. So you're establishing the structure for the entire forest with this domain. Make sure you got one NIC with one IP. Make sure you're aware of your IP mask and gateway. Also, make sure you know your hard drive configuration for how you're going to install this domain controller, what disk it's going to be, and so on. One other point about the disk for the virtual machine, if it is a VM and you're storing this in a vSphere environment or a more advanced Hyper-V environment, the virtual machine itself is just a file. Now that file can be stored on a RAID 5 as well to protect it. So make sure you have all those considerations in place. Without further ado, let's do our DCPromo. Now keep in mind that I did not install the ADDS role. And this box right here is showing us that the Active Directory binaries have not yet been laid down. So if we would have installed the ADDS role first, the Active Directory Directory Services role first, then this step right here would be skipped because that would have already been done. And then the DCPromo wizard would just pop up for you and let you go through your DCPromo. So it takes just a minute for it to install the binaries and get those laid down. And then once that's done, it'll start the ADDS wizard. And now that we have the binaries laid down, we can go through the wizard. This is the Welcome to the Active Directory Installation Services wizard. This wizard helps you install Active Directory domain services on the server, making the server a Active Directory domain controller. To continue, click Next. And I'm going to go ahead and check off the Advanced checkbox here. And it just tells you what you're doing for compatibility. You want to make sure that your domain controllers are compatible if you have existing domain controllers. I'm not really too worried about this particular warning that comes up during the wizard because we're doing everything brand new from scratch. Also, this isn't too important since we're doing it brand new from scratch. Brand new from scratch, our very first forest or brand new domain, we're going to pick that bottom radio button, which is create a new domain in a new forest, because we don't have an existing forest. We don't have an existing domain. However, if I was installing into an existing forest, I would pick this radio button. I could add a domain controller to an existing domain to add my second domain controller. I could create a new domain in an existing forest, or I can create a new domain root tree instead of a child domain. So there's a bunch of options that we have if we're not doing this from scratch. And I have some other video presentations on these other options as we start adding in additional domain controllers, additional child domains, additional trees, or if we decide to create a separate forest. So for now, just simple, we're going to do this one right here, a brand new domain and a brand new forest. And of course, we picked our name. Again, very important to make sure that whatever name you're going to give it is something you're going to stick with, right? It is possible to change the name with the proper domain and forest configuration, but man, you want to avoid that at all cost. Then it goes out and makes sure there's no name conflict. And while it's doing that, I'm going to switch back over here. Now, I just found that name. So what we're doing right now is we're building this structure. This is the logical structure. This is my forest boundary. This is my domain name. And this is going to be my forest root domain. Okay, so it found that NetBIOS name. There's no conflict, so we're good with that. And we have our forest level. And we're not going to raise our forest level. And the one thing that's kind of interesting is even though we have everything is brand new 2008 R2, our default forest level is actually Windows Server 2003. Now, if I hit the drop down, we can see that it can go from 2000 to 2003 to 2008 to 2008 R2. Now, what I probably could do, since I'm doing everything from scratch, is just go ahead and make it 2008 R2. If I was doing an upgrade and I still had 2003 domain controllers, I would pick this level right here. So it just depends what you have existing. Even though I only have 2008 R2, I'm going to go ahead and leave these at their default for both the forest level and the domain level. We can always raise them later. Okay, now this next one here is a very important point of discussion. When you go to install your very first domain controller, you have to ask yourself a couple of questions. Number one, do I have an existing DNS server that I'm pointing to? If I do have an existing DNS server that I'm pointing to, where is it? Is it on my premise? Is it at the ISP? If it's at the ISP, you definitely are not going to be using it. If it's on your premise, is it a Windows DNS server that you're pointing to, or is it a Unix-based DNS server that you're using? I would highly recommend, due to Microsoft's ability to support it, to not use a Unix-based DNS. Your best bet is to, on this domain controller, install DNS. Now let me switch back over to this graphic. Now this box right here is currently pointing over to this guy right here. Right? He is pointing to this router for DNS, right? So we are using him for DNS right now. But even though I'm pointing to him for DNS, and even though it's a Microsoft DNS, I really don't want to use that DNS. What I want to do is install DNS on the same box that's going to be my domain controller. So I want to put DNS right there on that same box. So we're going to go ahead and do that. And again, the reason we want to do that is it allows us to have Active Directory integrated DNS zones. It allows us to make sure we're supported by Microsoft. It also ensures we have the proper support for something called service location records, or SRV records. And everything's going to work the way we want. I can't emphasize it enough. Everything that we do in an Active Directory environment is based on DNS. It's like the foundation. It's kind of like the pillars that hold everything up. And we're going to have these special records that are called SRV records. And we want to make sure that we're using the Microsoft DNS to have those SRV records created correctly for us and to be fully supported by Microsoft. It sees there's no existing DNS that we can connect to, so we're going to go ahead and continue. We know that we don't have any other DNS servers that we can be a child of. Then we can also pick our database folder. Again, since everything is right here on the C drive, and the C drive in my case is a VMDK, and that's stored on drives that are protected, I don't really have to divide it up. But if this was a physical server, I might consider, using the E drive for my logs and have that mirrored, and then have my database on my F drive, which is my RAID 5, and just leave my sysvol on drive C. And that would give me separation that I need to give me good performance for my database and to give me fault tolerance for my log files. If you change your mind, you can always move these later. You can always move them around. But if I had a drive to pick from, I could hit the browse button and I could go to my E drive, right? I could go to my F drive, whatever is my RAID 5 or my mirror. So log file should be mirrored and your database should be on your RAID 5. We're just going to leave that as the default. Now this password is a separate password for the administrator, which is just for directory services restore mode. So there's one administrator, but he has two different passwords, a password to log in with and a password for directory services restore mode. So this password can actually be a different password than what I actually log in with. If you ever forget this password, you're still logging in as administrator, you can always go in to ntdsutil and reset that password there. So this is a special password that's used when you reboot your domain controller up and you choose F8 and you go into directory services restore mode. So it's just for that. This is not for your regular login. But I would recommend to make that a different password. And then it gives us a summary of everything right here. We can also export this to an answer file so we can use this to build another domain controller later. Another option I like is the reboot upon completion. It gives us the ability to let this guy finish and do a reboot because we can't actually use our domain controller until after the reboot is completed. And that's pretty quick. Now, it may take a little bit longer on a physical machine. This is a virtual machine running on a solid state drive, so it might be a little bit faster than you would see in production. Plus the fact that it's a VM might make it a little bit quicker. So just keep that in mind. The other thing I want to say is there's no difference in doing the installation that I'm demonstrating in a VM versus doing this on physical hardware. All the steps I showed you are the same. The only consideration you may have is your disk drive configuration, and also be careful about the NICs that you have in your box. Your domain controller can get very confused if he gets registered in DNS under the same name with different IP addresses, and he will automatically add those records to DNS because the DNS that we have installed will support something called dynamic update. So definitely keep that in mind as you do your install. Okay, so that is done booting up. We're going to go ahead and do the login. And we can verify that we have everything in place just by going into Active Directory users and computers real quick. And we'll go to Active Directory users and computers. And we can see we have our domain. Look at that, very nice. And we can go into advanced features to see everything. A couple things I want to point out right after the install is that you're going to have a domain controller OU. Now this is the only OU that you get by default. See that little icon right there? That tells you that it's an OU. All these other guys are just containers. You can also create your own organizational units if you want to as well. But your domain controller by default lives in this default domain controller OU. And there's nothing in the computers container yet. Now we do have a Windows 7 machine over here that we can actually join to the domain now that we have Active Directory installed. And also I wanted to point out, you do get these other tools. After the installation, you're going to get the Active Directory Domains and Trusts. And in Active Directory Domains and Trusts, we can actually see that we can raise our forest level. And it's kind of interesting. Active Directory Domains and Trusts is really the only place where you can see the forest. The forest doesn't really show up as a name anywhere. Like this very first domain that you create, itvc.local, is your forest root domain. And it doesn't really jump out at you and really smack you in the face that this is your forest root domain. So if you see this here, we can actually see that this is our very first domain in the forest because it's the highest in the hierarchy, right? And we can also raise our domain functional over here at the domain level. We can also build trust relationships in that tool. I can also see that I have ADSI edit to do some editing in my Active Directory database if I need to. And I have Active Directory sites and services. I have the Active Directory module for PowerShell. right? So I got some pretty cool stuff here included with my base installation and DCPromo of this box. And I would be able to join my computer to the domain. Now, one thing I want to show you before we finish off this video, which I think is very important, is we go take a look at the network card that we have in this box. We're going to see that the IP configuration will have been modified to 127.0.0.1. So this box is a domain controller, but it now also has DNS installed, right? So this box is now actually pointing to himself for DNS, and this DNS configuration that we have out of the box is going to look like this. If I close out of this and I go into my DNS, I just want to show you this. Very important to understand what happens with DNS upon the installation. I'm going to go into DNS, and I just want to show you what you get on the properties of your DNS server. So you just open up the DNS manager, you right click on your DNS server, DC1, whatever the name of your server is, and there is a forwarders tab. And by default, you can see that I was originally forwarding out. Now that's what I had before I started. Now under the root hints, we can see that we point out to some root hint servers out on the internet. Now I'm going to remove this forwarder that I added earlier. And I had added this in before to make sure I had internet access. So I can just delete that out of there. So I currently have no forwarder, but I do have root hints. So if I go out to my command prompt and I do an ns lookup, I'm able to resolve names on the internet because I have DNS installed and I have a root hints in there by default. So what I'm doing right now is I'm actually bypassing this DNS server at my router, and I'm going all the way out to the outside world, pointing to the .root out on the internet to resolve my names after the install. If I want to continue to point to this guy, I can go back into my DNS and I can put that forwarder back in there that I had before. And I can just put in that pointer to that other DNS server that I want to forward my queries to. That could be an internal DNS server, a server in your DMZ, or it could be a DNS server at your ISP, just like that. Another thing that people do that's pretty common is they might just point out to one of the well-known servers, like they might point to 4.2.2.1 is another option you could use as a forwarder. So what that means is anything that I can't resolve, I can point to the forwarder. And if I can't point to the forwarder, there's an option here to fall back and use root hints if the forwarder is not available. And this is a new feature in 2008 as well, this ability to fall back and use this option right here. Okay, so that's just what you get with your DNS by default. It doesn't really affect your day-to-day operations of your Active Directory as far as who you're pointing out to. It's important to know what those default configurations are for DNS. So, and with that, you have a totally built server, you have Active Directory installed, and you're ready to go ahead and start doing all your domain management. So that wraps up that video. Thank you very much, and we'll see you in the next video.